The first call came just after sunset, the kind of hour when the world was shifting between day and night, and everything felt slightly off-kilter. I was in the middle of grading papers when the phone buzzed against the countertop. The sound sharp and intrusive against the quiet hum of the house. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me hesitated before answering, like a voice at the back of my mind, warning me that nothing good waited on the other end. "Clara," the voice said, low and strained, the weight of urgency bleeding through the static. It was Mara Grayson, a woman I'd known since I was a child. Though we rarely spoke these days, her tone turned the air cold around me. "It's about the kids." I didn't need her to say more. I knew which kids she meant. Everyone in Ashwood had heard the rumors about them. Dylan, Harper, and Caleb. 3 teenagers whose defiance was as loud as their laughter, who had spent the last few months daring each other into more reckless stunts, and now they were gone. They were up by Blackwood Trail. Mara continued, her voice trembling. Dylan told his brother they'd be back before dark, but no one's heard from them. We found their bikes by the old trailhead, but there's no sign of them. Clara, you have to come. I didn't to go. The mention of Blackwood Trail twisted something deep in my gut, dredging up memories I'd spent years burying. But Mara's voice, the fear wrapped tight around every word, pulled me out of my chair. The papers on my desk fluttered as I grabbed my coat, my keys, my flashlight. The house felt colder as I stepped out, the evening air sharp against my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the edge of the trees. The trailhead was at the far side of town, where the houses thinned into forest and the roads turned to gravel. By the time I arrived, the light had bled from the sky, leaving the woods bathed in shadow. Mara was there, her face pale under the glow of her flashlight, and a small group of townsfolk had gathered around her. Their murmurs were low and anxious, their expressions tight with unease. No one wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Blackwood Trail wasn't a place you went after dark. Not anymore. I followed Mara to where the kids' bikes were lying in the grass, their frames tangled together like broken limbs. The sight of them made my stomach twist. They looked abandoned, forgotten, like the kids had dropped them and run, but there was no sign of running. Allu, Bibisil, Ataudvil. No scuffed earth, no snapped twigs, no frantic footprints leading into the trees, just silence. The flashlight in my hand felt heavier as I scanned the edge of the trail, the beam cutting through the shadows. The woods were too quiet, no wind, no insects, no sound at all, just the faint hum of the flashlight's bulb and the distant echo of my own breathing. It was the kind of silence that crawled under your skin, that made you feel small and exposed, like the trees were leaning in closer with every second. They wouldn't have gone far, Mara said behind me, but her voice lacked conviction. She was holding something in her hands, a backpack with a patch on the front, a small red star sewn into the fabric. Harper's backpack. The sight of it made my chest tighten, and I didn't realize I'd taken a step back until my heel caught on a rock. The flashlight wavered in my hand, and the shadows seemed to shift, pulling at the edges of the light. I forced myself to move forward, stepping onto the trail where the dirt was packed hard beneath my boots. The air here was colder, sharper, and it carried the faint scent of something metallic, something wrong. The trees arched overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. And the deeper I walked, the harder it became to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a tree, one of the massive old oaks that dotted the woods, its trunk gnarled and blackened with age. But as the light from my flashlight hit it, the shape resolved into something else entirely. It wasn't a tree. It was a hollow, an ancient, rotting structure of wood and bark that seemed to rise up from the earth itself. Its surface was scarred with deep, jagged carvings, symbols that twisted and spiraled in patterns that made my head ache just looking at them. The ground around it was disturbed. The dirt churned and scattered, as if something had clawed its way out of the earth. And there, at the base of the hollow, was a single shoe, a small black sneaker with frayed laces, half buried in the dirt. Caleb's, Epla, Caleb's, Keshavum, Gebranku. The hum started then, low and insistent, vibrating through the air like the echo of something vast and distant. It wasn't coming from the hollow. It was coming from beneath it, resonating through the ground, through my chest, making my heartbeat stutter in time with its rhythm. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat, and the shadows around me seemed to deepen, pooling at the edges of the hollow like ink spreading through water. I turned, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, and froze. Something moved at the edge of the trail, a flicker of motion just beyond the reach of the light. It was gone before I could see it clearly, but the impression of it lingered, a shape too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent the wrong way. My hand tightened around the flashlight, the metal slick with sweat, and I forced myself to keep moving, my steps quick and uneven. By the time I reached Mara and the others, the hum was gone, swallowed by the silence of the woods. I didn't tell them what I'd seen, what I'd felt. There was no way to explain it, no way to make them understand the weight of the hollow, and the whispers that seemed to cling to the air around it. But I could see it in their faces. The same fear, the same unease. They felt it too. One day, they were down. I felt it too. We called the search off that night, though no one said why. Mara's voice was tight as she thanked everyone for coming, and the group scattered quickly, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies as they made their way back to the safety of the town. I stayed behind for a moment, my gaze fixed on the trail where the hollow waited, its scarred surface hidden in the darkness. The woods felt alive now, the silence bristling with the weight of something unseen. And as I turned to leave, I thought I heard it again, a low, distant hum, faint and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. By morning, the woods were still. Too still. the kind of stillness that didn't come naturally, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I could feel it the moment I stepped onto the trail, the cool morning air pressing down on me, the sunlight doing little to chase away the unease that had settled deep in my chest. The search party was smaller this time, just a handful of volunteers and Ethan Grayson, Mara's brother. Ethan had grown up here, same as me, but he'd been gone for years, only recently coming back after a failed business venture out west. He hadn't lost that stubborn confidence, though, and now he was the one leading the group, his voice steady and sure as he laid out the plan. I kept to myself as we moved down the trail, my flashlight bouncing against my hip, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The hollow was still there, of course, standing like a sentinel at the edge of the path, its scarred surface hidden beneath the dappled morning light. No one else seemed to notice it, their gazes sliding past it, like it was just another tree. But I could feel it, the weight of it pressing against my thoughts, the faint hum vibrating at the edges of my hearing. We fanned out into the woods, the group splitting into pairs. And Ethan stuck with me, his presence a steadying force, even as the unease continued to grow. The underbrush was thick, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots, and the air carried that same faint metallic tang I'd noticed the night before. It was the smell of something wrong, something that didn't belong here. "Do you think they're still out here?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice cutting through the silence. I didn't answer right away. What could I say? That I didn't think we'd find them alive? That I wasn't even sure we'd find them at all. Instead, I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the ground. "I don't know," I said finally, "but we have to try." We moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing taller and denser, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blotted out the sun. The air grew colder, sharper, and the faint hum I'd heard earlier seemed to grow louder, resonating through the ground beneath my feet. I stopped, my hand tightening around the flashlight, and turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the forest. There was something here. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I could feel it, a presence that pressed against the edges of my thoughts, cold and unrelenting. Ethan must have felt it too, because he stopped beside me, his expression shifting from determination to something closer to fear. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The hum wasn't just sound anymore. It was movement, subtle and rhythmic, vibrating through the air like the beat of a drum. It was coming from ahead, deeper into the woods, and I felt my feet moving before I'd made the conscious decision to follow it. The trees thinned as we approached, the underbrush giving way to a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, their surfaces blackened and worn, arranged in a rough spiral. The ground around them was scorched, the grass and leaves reduced to ash, and the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. My stomach twisted at the sight, the memories of that night years ago flashing through my mind like shards of broken glass. Ethan stepped forward, his brow furrowing as he crouched beside one of the stones. "These marks," he said, tracing his fingers over the jagged carvings etched into the surface. "They're old. Older than the town, maybe. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see the symbols, to feel the weight of them pressing into my chest. But my gaze was drawn to them anyway, my eyes following the sharp, angular lines that spiraled inward, pulling me into their center. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Clara," Ethan's voice broke through the haze, his hand steadying me as I fought to catch my breath. "You okay?" I shook my head, unable to speak, and pointed toward the center of the spiral. Something was there, half buried in the ash. A piece of cloth, tattered and burned, but still recognizable. It was red, with a small patch sewn into the corner. Harper's jacket. Ethan moved first, brushing away the ash to reveal the rest of it. The jacket was torn, the fabric scorched and frayed, but there was no sign of Harper, no blood, no footprints, no trace of her beyond the jacket itself. It was as if she'd simply vanished, leaving only the remnants of her clothing behind. The hum shifted, the vibrations deepening, and the air grew colder. I turned, my eyes scanning the tree line, and froze. There was something there, just at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, tall and thin, its form shifting like smoke. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering as I raised it toward the shadow. But by the time the light reached it, it was gone. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Enuvigao, Albal." "No." Ethan hesitated, his gaze lingering on the stones. But he didn't argue. We turned back toward the trail, our steps quick and uneven, the hum following us like a second heartbeat. The forest felt different now, darker and more alive, the trees pressing in around us as though trying to trap us. The faint whispers started then, threading through the silence like a song just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and urgent, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. By the time we reached the others, the hum had faded, but the weight of it lingered, heavy and unshakable. Mara was waiting for us at the trailhead, her face pale and drawn, her eyes widening as she saw the jacket in Ethan's hands. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence said it all. As the group began to disperse, I felt it again, that pull, faint but insistent, drawing me back toward the woods. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the dirt path beneath my feet. But the feeling stayed with me, pressing against my thoughts like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The woods weren't done with us. Not yet. The unease didn't leave me, even after I'd left the woods. It clung to my skin, my clothes, like the faint scent of smoke that I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. The silence of the house was no better. And the home, how every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside felt amplified, like the echoes of a memory I couldn't quite place. I left the flashlight on the counter, its beam still weak from whatever had drained it earlier, and sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the darkened tree line beyond the edge of the yard. I wanted to convince myself that the shadow I'd seen, the hum I'd heard, was nothing but my imagination running wild. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. The forest had always been a place of whispers and half-seen things. A shadow cast over Ashwood that no one dared to talk about, not openly. And now, it was awake. The next day, Ethan showed up at my door, his face pale, but determined. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. I could see it in his eyes, the same questions, the same dread curling in his chest. He held out a small leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with age, and I hesitated before taking it. The cover was blank, the leather worn smooth, but when I opened it, the first page was scrawled with a name I hadn't heard in years. Thomas Grayson. "Where did you find this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad's attic," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I was looking for, I don't know, answers, I guess. Thought maybe this would help." Thomas Grayson had been one of the town's oldest residents before he passed. A man with a reputation for knowing things he shouldn't have known. When I was younger, my parents used to warn me to stay away from him. Said he was full of crazy stories about the forest and the town's history. But now, as I flipped through the pages of his journal, those stories didn't seem so crazy. The entries were short, written in shaky handwriting that grew more erratic with each page. They spoke of the forest, of the hollow, of something deeper, darker, that lived beneath the surface of Ashwood. He called it the Hollow King, a name that sent a shiver down my spine. According to Thomas, it wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was angry. Ethan sat across from me as I read, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "Do you believe it?" he asked after a long silence. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The memory of the hum, the shadow in the clearing, the scorched ground around the stones, they all pointed to the same conclusion, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. The next entry stopped me cold. The next entry stopped. "We made a pact," it read, the words underlined with such force that the pen had torn through the paper. A sacrifice every generation to keep the Hollow King bound. But the seals are weakening. He's waking up. My hands shook as I turned the page, but the next entry was incomplete, the words trailing off into an illegible scroll. The rest of the journal was the same, half-finished sentences, fragmented thoughts, like Thomas had been interrupted before he could finish, or like he'd been trying to write through the terror that had taken hold of him. "We need to go back," I said, my voice steady despite the fear twisting in my chest. Ethan stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Back where?" "To the hollow," I said, meeting his gaze. "If Thomas was right, if this is real, Then we need to figure out what's happening before it's too late. He didn't argue, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. Instead, he nodded, and we spent the next hour gathering what we could. Flashlights, a map of the forest, a few tools that might be useful if the trail turned dangerous. The journal stayed tucked under my arm as we left, its weight a constant reminder of what we were walking into. The forest was different this time. The trail that had felt familiar just a day ago now seemed foreign, the trees pressing closer together, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy, casting the path in an eerie half-light that made every shadow seem alive. The hum started again as we neared the clearing, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. My pulse quickened, the sound threading through my thoughts like a needle, pulling stitches tight. Ethan walked ahead of me, his flashlight sweeping the ground, but I could tell he felt it too. His shoulders were tense, his steps more cautious, like he was bracing for something to leap out of the darkness. When we reached the hollow, the air seemed to shift. It was colder here, the ground harder beneath my boots, and the scars on the hollow's surface were deeper now, the symbols twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. The hum was everywhere, vibrating through the air, the ground, my chest, and I had to fight to keep my breathing steady. Ethan stepped closer, his flashlight casting long shadows across the hollow, and I saw it, the faintest glow emanating from the cracks in its surface. It wasn't just a tree. It never had been. It was a gateway, a tether between this world and something else, and the seals that had once held it shut were breaking. Before I could stop him, Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against the hollow's surface. The glow flared, blinding and hot, and he stumbled back with a gasp, clutching his hand. The hum rose to a deafening roar, and the ground beneath us trembled, the cracks in the hollow widening as the light spilled out in jagged beams. "Clara?" Ethan said, his voice tight with panic, but I couldn't answer. The light had taken hold of me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, and I felt it. The presence on the other side, vast and endless and hungry. It wasn't just waking up. It was waiting. The light dimmed, the hum receding into a low, steady vibration, and I collapsed to my knees, the journal slipping from my grasp. Ethan knelt beside me, his hand shaking as he gripped my shoulder, and together we stared at the hollow, its glow fading into the darkness. Whatever we'd disturbed, it wasn't done with us yet. The hollow didn't stop glowing. The faint light bled from its cracks, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Each flicker seemed to sync with the hum in the air, vibrating low and steady, pressing against my chest. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence, a thing with weight, with intention. It was alive in ways I didn't want to understand. Ethan sat beside me on the cold ground, still clutching his hand. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and I could see the faint scorch marks on his palm where he'd touched the hollow. The skin wasn't blistered, but the marks were precise. lines that twisted and coiled like the symbols carved into the hollow itself. He didn't say anything. Oh, shh. He didn't have to. I could see the fear in his eyes. The same fear, clawing its way up my throat, making it hard to breathe. The hum grew louder, filling the space between us, and I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling under the weight of it. The forest around us was darker now, the trees looming taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The clearing felt smaller, the air heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My words sounded hollow, swallowed by the hum before they even reached Ethan. I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet, and together we stumbled back toward the trail, away from the hollow and the presence that lingered there. But the forest didn't let us leave easily. And the path that had been so clear before was gone, swallowed by the shifting shadows. The trees seemed to close in around us, their roots twisting up from the earth like grasping hands. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out, and every time the light faltered, I swore I saw movement, shapes darting between the trees, just out of reach. Ethan clutched his injured hand against his chest, his other hand gripping my arm as we pushed forward. The hum followed us, growing fainter, but never fully disappearing, like a thread pulling taut between us and the hollow. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse racing, and I couldn't tell if it was fear or the air itself that made it so hard to breathe. The metallic tang was back, sharp and bitter, coating my tongue with every inhale. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, just a low murmur, threading through the hum, barely discernible from the rustling of leaves. But as we moved deeper into the forest, they grew louder, more distinct. Voices, overlapping and chaotic, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. They weren't words, they were feelings, images pressed into my mind with every syllable. Pain, time, day, hunger, tut, loneliness, and something deeper, darker, that made my skin crawl. Ethan stopped suddenly, his grip on my arm tightening. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The whispers weren't just around us anymore. They were inside us, threading through our thoughts like vines wrapping around a tree. They pulled at the edges of my mind, unraveling memories, twisting my sense of time and place until I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The forest felt endless, the shadows stretching out in every direction, the hum vibrating through my bones. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was another shadow, one of the many that flickered and shifted at the edges of the flashlight beam. But as the light steadied, the shape resolved into something solid, something real. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, its eyes, or what should have been a face, was smooth and featureless, its its surface reflecting the faint light like polished glass. It didn't move toward us. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough, pressing against my chest like a physical weight, making it hard to stand, to breathe, to think. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single deafening roar, and I felt my knees buckle, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me upright, and together we stumbled backward, our steps uneven and frantic. The thing didn't follow, but its presence lingered, the weight of it pressing against my back as we fled. I didn't know how long we ran. Time felt meaningless, the forest stretching out endlessly around us. But eventually, the whispers faded, replaced by the low, steady hum that had haunted us since we'd found the hollow. We collapsed at the base of a tree, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, the flashlight's faint beam casting long shadows across the ground. My hands were shaking, my chest tight, and I couldn't stop the images flashing through my mind. The hollow, the symbols, the thing in the forest that wasn't a shadow, wasn't human. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block it out. But the whispers lingered, faint and persistent, just at the edge of hearing. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "What the hell is happening, Clara?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say, how to explain the things we'd seen, the things we'd felt. All I knew was that we weren't supposed to be here. The forest didn't want us here, and neither did whatever was waking up beneath it. The hum grew louder, the ground beneath us trembling faintly, and I forced myself to stand, pulling Ethan to his feet. We couldn't stay here. We had to keep moving, had to find a way out before the forest swallowed us completely. The flashlight flickered, its beam growing dimmer, and I felt the pull again. That faint, insistent tug dragging me back toward the hollow, toward the presence waiting beneath it, but couldn't go back. Not yet. Heavenly. We stumbled forward, our steps uneven, the whispers threading through the air like a distant song. The path was still gone, the trees pressing closer with every step. But I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out, to put as much distance as possible between us and the hollow, between us and the thing waiting in the dark. The forest didn't let us leave easily, but eventually the trees began to thin, the shadows less oppressive, and the hum grew fainter, replaced by the distant sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. The edge of the forest came into view, the faint glow of the town lights cutting through the darkness, and I felt my knees give out, the ground rushing up to meet me. We were safe, for now. But as I looked back at the forest, at the shadows shifting just beyond the tree line, I knew the hollow wasn't done with us. Not yet. The town felt different when we stumbled back into its edges. It wasn't the quiet of the early evening, or the distant hum of life winding down. It was the absence of something vital, like the air had shifted, hollowed out, leaving nothing behind but a faint echo. The woods had followed us, their presence lingering in the shadows that stretched long across the streets, and in the way, the wind seemed to whisper through the empty spaces. Ethan didn't speak the entire way back to my house. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. Haunted, hollow, like he was still seeing the twisting symbols on the hollow, still hearing the hum vibrating in his skull. I felt it too, an ache at the base of my spine that spread upward with every step. Every breath, a constant reminder that we hadn't left the forest behind. Not really. When we finally stepped inside, the house felt impossibly small. The walls pressing closer, the air heavy and still. Ethan collapsed into the chair by the kitchen table, his hand cradled against his chest. The faint marks burned into his palm, stark against his skin. I moved to the sink, running the water until it was as cold as it would go, and pressed a glass into his hand. He didn't drink it, just held it, the condensation dripping onto his jeans. What did we wake up? His voice was quiet, hoarse, as though speaking too loudly might summon something neither of us could face. I didn't answer right away. My hands trembled as I grabbed the journal we'd taken from his father's attic, its weight heavier than it had any right to be. The worn leather was smooth beneath my fingers, and as I flipped through the pages, the symbols seemed to shift on the edges of my vision, twisting into shapes I couldn't quite hold on to. "The Hollow King," I said finally, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "It's not just a story." Ethan didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the grain of the table. "We didn't just wake it up," he said. "We let it out." The words hit harder than they should have, like a fist to my chest. But I knew he was right. The crack in the hollow, the light spilling out in jagged beams, the whispers that had clawed at our thoughts. They weren't just warnings. They were promises, quiet and unrelenting, that something old and vast and hungry was coming. I flipped to the last legible page in the journal, my pulse quickening as I read Thomas Grayson's final entry. The words were scrawled in a frantic hand, barely legible, but the desperation was clear. "The seals are breaking. It's not enough. A sacrifice must be made to keep the pact." I dropped the journal onto the table, the sound startling Ethan out of his trance. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The weight of the words hung between us like a noose, tightening with every second. The seals weren't just failing, they'd been deliberately broken, and the only way to repair them was the same way they'd been created, through sacrifice. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "We're not doing that. We're not playing by its rules. We might not have a choice," I said, my voice shaking. "If it gets out, if it fully wakes up, there won't be anything left to save." His fist slammed against the table, the glass tumbling to the floor and shattering into jagged pieces. The sound was sharp, final, and for a moment, the silence that followed was heavier than the hum that still lingered in the back of my mind. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his shoulders trembling. "It's not fair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it have to be us?" I didn't have an answer for that. The forest didn't care about fairness. The hollow didn't care about the lives it tore apart. All it cared about was the pact, the balance it demanded, the blood it needed to stay quiet. The next few hours passed in a blur. Ethan paced the length of the kitchen, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, while I scoured the journal for anything we'd missed, any way to seal the hollow without feeding it another soul. But every page led back to the same conclusion, the same unrelenting truth. The seals were tied to the pack, and the pact demanded a life. A life. The sun was just starting to rise when we made our way back to the forest. The trail that had felt so alive the day before was dead now. The air sharp and brittle, the ground hard beneath our boots. The hum greeted us the moment we stepped into the clearing, louder than before, vibrating through the trees like the rhythm of a heartbeat too vast to comprehend. The hollow stood waiting, its cracks wider, the light spilling out in jagged beams that carved through the shadows. Ethan hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his hand tightening around my arm. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, desperate. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But it doesn't matter." The hollow pulsed, the light flaring brighter as we approached, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward its center. The ground trembled beneath my feet, the hum rising to a deafening roar, and I dropped to my knees, the journal slipping from my grasp. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices threading through the roar, filling the air with their demands. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the edge of the hollow. The light surged, consuming everything, and I felt it again. That presence, vast and unrelenting, pressing against the edges of my thoughts, waiting to break through. The forest dissolved around me, the clearing falling away into shadow, and I was alone. The hum was gone, replaced by silence, so deep it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, out of the darkness, the voice came, low and resonant, cutting through the stillness like a blade. One life for the many, one life for the seal. I knew what it wanted, I knew what it was asking, and I knew what it meant if I said no. The hollow's light flared again, brighter than the sun, and I felt the weight of its presence settle over me. Vast and endless, the forest didn't matter. The town didn't matter. All that mattered was the seal, the pact, and the life it demanded. I opened my eyes, the light blinding, and made my choice. The light didn't burn like I thought it would. It wasn't heat or fire that surrounded me. It was cold, bone deep, numbing. Like the moment before a winter storm, when the air hangs heavy with the promise of something brutal. The hum returned, louder than ever, not just in my ears, but in my chest. My skull, my very blood. It wasn't sound anymore. It was life. It, or maybe, the absence of it. I opened my eyes, and the clearing was gone. I was somewhere else now, somewhere vast and endless, where the ground and sky blurred together into a void of shifting gray. The air shimmered with faint light, spiraling in patterns too intricate to follow, their edges always just out of reach. It was like standing inside the hollow itself, like the world had folded in on itself and pulled me into the crack. I wasn't alone. The presence was everywhere, pressing against my skin, wrapping around my lungs. It didn't have a shape, not exactly. It was too big, too vast, too wrong to be contained in anything I could understand. But I felt it. I felt its hunger, its rage, its patience. It had been waiting here, in this place between places, for so long that time itself had unraveled around it. The whispers started again, threading through the hum, filling the void with words that weren't words. They spoke in feelings, in memories that weren't mine, each one sharper than the last. I wanted got pain dot tor. Tunning taste years. Petla. Despair. A yearning so deep it felt like it might tear me apart. I staggered forward, my legs heavy, the cold sinking deeper into my bones with every step. Ahead of me, the spirals of light twisted into something new, a figure, faint and insubstantial, its edges flickering like static. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze burning through the fog. It wasn't human. It never had been, but there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of my mind. I stopped a few feet away, my chest heaving, my breath visible in the freezing air. The figure tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, and the hum shifted, deepening into a low, resonant thrum that made my teeth ache. It didn't need to speak for me to understand. You've come to bargain. The words weren't mine. They weren't anyone's. They simply existed, threading through the silence like smoke, wrapping around my thoughts, until I couldn't tell where they ended, and I began. I nodded, my hands trembling at my sides. It moved closer, the light twisting and writhing as it did, and I felt the weight of it settle over me, pinning me in place. It wasn't just a presence, it was the hollow, the forest, the pact itself, all of it bound together in a single, unrelenting force. And it wanted something from me. One life for the seal, it said. The balance must be restored. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw. If I do this, I said, my voice shaking, if I give you what you want, will it end? Will the town be safe? The hum deepened, the vibrations rattling through my chest. The figure tilted its head again, and I felt the cold twist tighter around me, cutting into my skin like knives. The town will be safe. For now. The last two words echoed in my mind, louder than the others. and I felt the faintest flicker of doubt. But there wasn't time for doubt. The crack was widening, the seals breaking. And if I didn't do this, if I didn't stop it, there wouldn't be anything left to save. I took a step forward, my knees buckling under the weight of the presence, and raised my hands. The light twisted around me, tightening like a noose, and the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single deafening roar. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat slower than the last, until it felt like the hum had replaced it entirely. The figure raised a hand, its edges flickering, and I felt the pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the center of the spirals. The void shifted around me, the light growing brighter, sharper, and I saw them, the faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their hollow eyes staring back at me, their mouths open in silent screams. They weren't alive, not anymore. Beautiful, still, bananas. They were the sacrifices that had come before me, their souls bound to the seal, their existence reduced to nothing but echoes. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The weight of their stares pressed against me, pulling at the edges of my resolve. But I couldn't stop now. The forest didn't care about my fear, my guilt. It only cared about the pact. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out, and I felt the cold wrap around my chest, tightening until I couldn't breathe. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the spirals flaring brighter, and the void seemed to collapse inward, pulling me into its center. And then everything went still. The light dimmed, the hum fading into a low, steady vibration, and the figure stepped back, its edges softening, flickering. I dropped to my knees, my body trembling, the cold receding just enough for me to take a shuddering breath. "It is done," the voice said, softer now, almost distant. "The seal is restored." The spirals twisted one final time, their light dissolving into the void, and the figure faded, its form unraveling like smoke. The weight lifted, the whispers falling silent, and for a moment there was nothing but darkness, vast and empty and unrelenting. When the light returned, I was back in the clearing. The hollow stood before me, its cracks gone, the surface smooth and unbroken. The hum was faint now, barely a whisper, and the air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Ethan was there, standing a few feet away, his face pale, his eyes wide. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, like I was something he couldn't quite understand. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words caught in my throat, the cold still lingering in my chest. I wasn't the same anymore. I could feel it deep in my bones, in the hollow space where my heartbeat used to be. The seal had been restored, but the cost was something I could never get back. The forest was quiet as we left, the path winding back toward the town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The hum was still there, faint and distant, a reminder of what I'd done, of what I'd become. The hum was softer now, almost imperceptible, but it never left me. It stayed there, just below the surface, a faint vibration threading through my thoughts, reminding me of what had happened, of what I had done. The air in Ashwood was quieter too, the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from waiting, from knowing. The forest hadn't gone back to sleep. Not entirely. Ethan and I hadn't spoken since we left the clearing. He stayed at my house that night, sitting at the kitchen table while I stared at the blank pages of a notebook, unable to write anything down. Every word I thought of seemed too small to capture what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The light, the cold, the faces, all of it was etched into my mind, vivid and unrelenting. When the sun rose, Ethan was gone. I didn't blame him. But he hadn't signed up for this. None of us had. The days that followed were strange, heavy with a tension I couldn't name. The town moved on, as it always did, its people pretending that the woods weren't creeping closer, that the shadows weren't darker than they'd been before. But I could see it in their eyes, the way they glanced at the tree line and quickly looked away, the way their voices dropped when they talked about the missing kids. They knew, even if they didn't say it out loud. I tried to go back to my life, to the small routines that had once felt comforting. Grading papers, walking to the store, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. But the forest was always there, watching, waiting. The hollow had sealed itself, but the scars it left behind hadn't healed. One night, the hum woke me. It was louder than before, sharper, and it pulled me out of sleep like a hook dragging me from the depths. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, and listened. It wasn't just the hum this time. There were whispers too, faint and distant, threading through the stillness like a needle pulling at the seams of reality. They weren't coming from the woods. They were coming from inside the house. And I moved slowly, my bare feet brushing against the cold floor as I stepped into the hallway. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, and the air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing against my skin. The hum pulsed through me with each step, growing stronger as I moved toward the kitchen. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow, a trick of the dim light playing against the walls. But as I stepped closer, the shape became clearer. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its edges flickering like static. Its face, or the absence of one, was smooth and featureless, reflecting the faint glow of the moonlight. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Its presence was enough to freeze me in place, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the hum vibrating through my chest, and the thing tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The cold wrapped around me, sharp and unrelenting, and I felt it, faint and fleeting but undeniable. recognition. This wasn't the first time I'd seen it. It had been there in the clearing, in the void, in the spirals of light that had consumed everything. It had been watching me then, just as it was now. It would have been just and it toward and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it hadn't come to hurt me. It had come to remind me. The whispers stopped suddenly, the hum fading into silence, and the thing turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It walked toward the back door, its steps light and soundless. And I followed, my legs moving without my consent. The door opened on its own, the cold night air spilling into the house, and the thing stepped outside, disappearing into the shadows beyond the porch. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. The forest was quiet, the hum barely a whisper, and the air felt still in a way that set my teeth on edge. I closed the door and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Whatever line had been crossed in those woods, whatever door had been opened, couldn't be shut with a deadbolt. The pact had been restored, but it wasn't over. It would never be over. The next morning, I went back to the hollow. The path was still there, winding through the trees, but the forest felt different now. It was quieter, heavier, like it was holding its breath. The clearing was empty when I arrived, the hollow standing at its center, its surface smooth and unbroken. The symbols were gone. The cracks healed, but I could still feel the weight of it pressing against me, faint but unrelenting. I stood there for a long time, staring at the hollow, waiting for something to happen. But the air remained still, the whispers silent. The forest didn't want me there, but it didn't push me away either. It simply watched, its presence wrapping around me like a second skin, a reminder of what I'd done, of what I'd become. When I finally turned to leave, I heard it, the faintest whisper threading through the trees, so soft it could have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. It was a voice, low and steady, speaking a single word that sent a chill down my spine. Soon. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The forest wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with it. Not yet. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp, metallic, like rusted iron left to rot in stagnant water. It clung to the air, heavy and wet, pressing against my skin. As I stood at the edge of the hospital grounds, the building loomed ahead of me, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the overcast sky. Every shattered window and jagged edge promising secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. The assignment wasn't supposed to bring me here. It was supposed to be a fluff piece, local history, What's left of Cedar Pine's most infamous hospital. A few interviews with the older residents, a walk through the archives, maybe some wistful shots of the crumbling exterior. But now I was here, trudging through the overgrown weeds and debris. Because something had happened, something no one wanted to talk about. Dan was to a day. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, frayed at the edges, barely clinging to the rusted poles that marked the perimeter. A warning, or maybe just a suggestion. It was obvious no one cared if you crossed it. They were more concerned about what might cross back out. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stepped closer, the sound too loud in the silence that hung over the property like a shroud. No birds, no wind, not even the hum of distant traffic. Just stillness, deep and unnatural, as though the world itself had paused to hold its breath. I reached the main entrance, or what was left of it. The doors had long since been torn from their hinges, replaced by jagged splinters and a yawning black void. My flashlight's beam cut into the darkness, illuminating graffiti scrawled walls and piles of debris that looked like they'd been untouched for decades. But there was something else, too, something fresher. Scratches in the dust on the floor, footprints leading deeper into the shadows. And then the phone. It was lying on the ground just past the doorway, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing, the battery clinging to the last scraps of light. The sight of it made my stomach twist, and I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. I crouched down, hesitating before picking it up. The plastic warm and slick against my palm. The screen flickered once, twice, and then a video began to play. The footage was shaky, the camera jerking wildly as the person holding it moved through the halls. It was dark, the only light coming from the phone's flashlight, casting long, flickering shadows against the peeling walls. Voices echoed faintly in the background. 2, maybe 3 people, laughing nervously, their words a jumble of bravado and uncertainty. Then the laughing stopped. The camera turned, the beam of light sweeping across the hallway, and for a moment, everything was still. Just an empty corridor, the walls covered in graffiti and grime, the floor littered with broken tiles and scraps of paper. But then, at the very edge of the frame, something moved. A shadow, darker than the rest, slipping out of sight before the light could catch it. The voices turned frantic, rising in pitch, and the camera jerked again, the image blurring as the person holding it began to run. The screen went dark for a moment, the sound replaced by heavy breathing and a distant echo of footsteps. And then the light returned, illuminating a door at the end of the hall. The camera panned down, focusing on the door's surface, and my breath caught in my throat. The symbol was crude, carved deep into the wood with jagged lines that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. It was circular, but the edges were uneven, broken, like shattered glass struggling to hold itself together. Vines of blackened grooves spiraled outward, twisting into patterns that made my head ache just looking at them. The screen flickered again, the image dissolving into static. And for a moment, I thought the video was over. But then the sound returned, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the speakers, growing louder, and deeper with every second. The camera shifted, the lens turning toward the darkness behind the group, and I saw it. A shape, bent, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its body flickering like static against the shadows. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting as though it were watching, waiting. And then the video cut out. I dropped the phone, my breath coming in shallow bursts, the weight of what I'd just seen pressing down on me like a physical force. My hands were shaking, my pulse racing, and for a moment I couldn't move. The hum from the video still echoed in my mind, low and insistent, threading through my thoughts like a needle pulling at the edges of reality. The air around me felt colder now, sharper, and I realized with a jolt that the silence had deepened. The distant sounds of the town were gone, swallowed by the stillness that clung to the hospital like a second skin. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and froze. The scratches on the floor weren't random. They weren't even scratches. They were symbols, etched into the dust with deliberate precision, forming a pattern that mirrored the one on the door in the video. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer, the beam of light illuminating the spirals and grooves that seemed to pulse faintly, almost imperceptibly, like they were alive. And then I heard it, a sound, faint and distant, threading through the silence like the first breath of a storm. It wasn't the hum from the video. It was lower, deeper, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, vast and unrelenting, pressing against me from all sides. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and stumbled against the doorway. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground, its beam flickering wildly as it rolled across the floor. The light caught on something, a shape at the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the shadows. It was still, impossibly still, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze heavy and suffocating. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls, the hum growing louder with every step. The air felt thicker, colder, dragging at my limbs, as though the building itself was trying to hold me back. I didn't stop until I burst through the doorway and into the open air, the sunlight cutting through the oppressive weight that had followed me out. But even as I stood there, gasping for breath, I could still feel it. The Yuma one. Shift steady, the weight on the presence. The presence. It was still there, watching, waiting, pulling at the edges of my mind. And I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that I'd brought it with me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The image of the symbol burned into my mind, twisting and shifting in the darkness every time I closed my eyes. And that shape, that flickering, impossible thing, just the memory of it made my chest tighten, made the air feel too thin. The hum was still there, faint but steady, like a second pulse, threading through my thoughts, The phone sat on the counter where I'd left it, its cracked screen black and lifeless. I hadn't touched it since the video stopped playing, but its presence seemed to fill the room, its weight pressing against me from across the space. I knew I needed to take it to someone, to the police, maybe, or one of the tech-savvy kids at the paper. But the thought of explaining what I'd seen, what I'd felt, made my stomach churn. By the time the first light of dawn seeped through the blinds, I'd made up my mind. If I wanted answers, I couldn't wait for someone else to find them. I had to go back. The streets were empty as I drove through town, the morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. Cedar pines always felt quiet this time of day, but now the silence felt heavier, more deliberate, like the town itself was holding its breath. ND, the hospital loomed in the distance as I approached, its jagged silhouette cutting against the sky, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. The hum grew louder, vibrating faintly through the air as I parked at the edge of the lot and stepped out. The weeds whispered against my boots as I made my way back to the entrance, their dry, brittle voices filling the silence like static. The police tape had fallen completely now, tangled in the underbrush, and the door stood open, its dark maw inviting me back inside. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, before stepping into the shadows. The air inside was colder than I remembered, sharp and biting against my skin. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the same graffiti-scrawled walls, the same piles of debris that had greeted me the day before. But now, there was something else. The footprints I'd seen before were still there, but they were joined by others, fainter, more erratic, like someone had been pacing back and forth, their movements frantic and uneven. The scratches on the floor were still there too, their spiral patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves, and felt a chill run through me. The lines were deeper now, the edges sharper, as though whatever had carved them was still working, still etching its presence into the very bones of the building. The hum grew louder as I moved deeper into the hospital, threading through the air like a low, unrelenting drumbeat. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, a weight that pressed against my chest, my skull, making it hard to think, to breathe. The halls stretched out around me, twisting and narrowing in ways that didn't feel natural, their walls bending inward like the building itself was alive. I followed the footprints, my flashlight flickering as the air grew colder. The path led me to a door at the end of the hall, its surface covered in peeling paint and the faint outlines of old warnings. Keep out. Do not enter. Do not enter. The words were barely legible now, obscured by years of grime and the jagged scars of new carvings. The same spiraling symbols I'd seen before, etched into the wood with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and felt the hum shift, its rhythm quickening, growing sharper. The whispers returned then, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a song, just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, urgent and wrong. The knob was ice cold beneath my fingers. As I turned it, the door groaning on its hinges as it swung open. The room beyond was small and dark, its walls lined with metal shelves, their surfaces cluttered with the remnants of whatever this place had once been. Old files, rusted tools, fragments of broken glass. But my eyes were drawn to the far corner, where something glinted faintly in the flashlight's beam. A mirror. Tranquil. Evil. It was cracked, its surface splintered into jagged shards that reflected the light in strange, fragmented patterns. The frame was ornate, its edges carved with the same spiraling designs that covered the walls, the floor, the door. The glass itself seemed to pulse faintly, the cracks shifting as I stepped closer, their jagged edges bending and twisting like they were alive. The hum rose to a deafening pitch as I approached, and I felt it again. That presence, vast and unrelenting, pressing against me from all sides. My breath hitched, my legs trembling beneath me, but I couldn't stop. The pull was stronger now, dragging me toward the mirror, toward the thing waiting behind it. My reflection stared back at me, fractured and distorted by the cracks in the glass. But there was something else, too. Something moving just behind me, its shape flickering at the edges of my vision. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its face smooth and featureless. The same thing I'd seen in the video. The same thing that had been watching me since I stepped into this place. I turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the room behind me was empty. The air was still, heavy, and the whispers had stopped, leaving only the hum, low and steady, vibrating through the floor. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned back to the mirror, my breath fogging the glass. And then it moved. Not my reflection, not the cracks. The thing. It moved closer, its shape flickering at the edges, its presence suffocating. The hum grew louder, the air colder, and I felt it, sharp and sudden, like a blade pressed against my thoughts. It wasn't just watching me, it was inside me, threading through my mind, unraveling everything I thought I knew. The glass shattered, the sound was sharp and jagged, cutting through the hum, and I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The room dissolved around me, the walls bending and twisting, the symbols burning bright and searing themselves into my vision. The presence surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and I felt myself falling, the ground dissolving beneath my feet. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the hallway, the flashlight's faint beam flickering against the ceiling. The door was closed, the room behind it silent, and the hum had faded into nothing. But the weight was still there, pressing against my chest, my mind, my soul. I picked up the flashlight, my hands trembling, and forced myself to stand. The hospital was silent now, its halls empty, but I knew better. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. It's enter, keys, and I never would be again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. The air in my apartment felt different, thicker somehow, as though the walls were closing in, pushing me towards something I couldn't see. The hum had faded by the time I left the hospital, but it never really left me. It lingered just at the edges of my thoughts, threading through the silence like a faint vibration, reminding me that I wasn't done with this, that it wasn't done with me. That it wasn't done with me. I sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead fixture casting long shadows across the room. The phone from the hospital sat in front of me, its cracked screen dark and lifeless. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every time I looked at it, I saw the mirror, the jagged cracks spiraling outward, and the thing that had stared back at me. It wasn't just fear that kept me away. It was the weight of knowing that the phone still had something to show me, something I wasn't ready to see. The journal from Alex sat next to it, its worn leather cover creased from years of neglect. I'd barely skimmed through it after he'd handed it to me, but now, in the heavy silence of my apartment, it felt like the only thing tethering me to reality. I opened it slowly, the pages brittle and yellowed, and traced my fingers over the faded ink that filled the margins. Most of it was a mess of names, dates, and fragmented thoughts, scrawled in a hand that grew more erratic as the entries went on. But there was a pattern buried beneath the chaos, a spiral of words and ideas that kept circling back to the same thing: the veil, the shard, the hospital, and the sacrifices. The first mention of it was faint, buried in an entry dated nearly 70 years ago. The shard cannot be contained without sacrifice. The veil must be maintained. The words were underlined, the ink darker and fresher than the rest of the entry, as though whoever had written it wanted to make sure it couldn't be ignored. The next few entries were shorter, sharper, as though the writer had been interrupted. The veil is fraying. We couldn't finish it in time. And then, scrawled across the bottom of a page, in letters so large they nearly tore through the paper: "The shard is awake." The hum started again, faint and distant, threading through the stillness of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and glanced toward the phone. Its screen was still dark, but the air around it seemed to shift, growing colder, sharper. The shadows on the walls lengthened, twisting into shapes that didn't belong, and I felt it, the same weight, the same presence that had pressed against me in the hospital. The journal slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a soft thud, and I stood, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, and I turned toward the window, drawn by a faint movement at the edge of my vision. The street below was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights casting pale halos across the pavement. But there was something there, standing just beyond the edge of the light, a shadow, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its edges flickering like static. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence filled the space, heavy and suffocating. My hands tightened around the edge of the table as I stared at it, my chest tightening with every second that passed. And then it stepped forward. The shadows bent around it, warping and twisting as it moved, and the hum rose to a deafening pitch, threading through my thoughts like a needle pulling at the edges of reality. I stumbled back, my legs trembling beneath me, and grabbed the phone without thinking, the cracked screen flaring to life as I pressed the button. The video started again, the same shaky footage from before, but this time the sound was sharper, more defined. The voices echoed through the room, frantic and overlapping, as the light from the camera swept across the walls. The spiral symbols glowed faintly in the beam, their edges pulsing like veins beneath the surface, and then the camera turned, focusing on the door. The symbol carved into the wood seemed to shift, its jagged edges bending and twisting in the light, and the voices cut off suddenly, replaced by a low, resonant hum. The camera trembled, the light flickering, and the door began to creak open, the darkness beyond it swallowing the frame. And then the screen went black. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the table, and I turned back to the window. The street was empty now, the shadow gone, but the air in the room felt heavier, colder, as though something had slipped through the cracks, unseen but not unfelt. The hum lingered, faint and insistent, threading through the silence. And I knew I couldn't stay here. I grabbed the journal from the floor, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything that would tell me what to do. The symbols stared back at me, their edges jagged and unrelenting, and the words seemed to blur together, their meanings slipping just out of reach. But then I saw it, scrawled in the corner of a page, almost too faint to read. It began with the chapel. It ends there. The chapel. I'd heard the stories, whispered in bars and over campfires, about the ruins deep in the wood. No one went there anymore, not since the hospital shut down. But the connection was obvious now, the threads weaving together into a single, unrelenting truth. If the chapel was where it started, then it was where I had to go. The hum grew louder as I grabbed my keys and stepped into the hallway, the air thick with the promise of something I couldn't yet name. The phone buzzed faintly against the table, its screen flickering with static. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The shadows were already waiting, stretching out toward me as I closed the door and stepped into the night. The woods seemed alive as I stepped into them, the air dense with the weight of something unseen. My flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam trembling as though it, too, was afraid of what lay ahead. The hum had returned, faint at first, vibrating in my chest, in my bones, but growing louder with every step. It wasn't just sound, it was movement, a subtle but unrelenting pulse, threading through the forest, guiding me deeper into its shadowed heart. The chapel was farther than I remembered from the old stories, its location buried beneath years of overgrowth and whispered warnings. My feet found the remnants of a trail, overgrown and uneven, and I followed it blindly, the journal pressed against my side. The entry about the chapel had been sparse, almost cryptic, but its urgency had been clear. It began with the chapel. Eus ilus episoma. Gane. It ends there. The trees pressed closer as I moved, their branches twisting together overhead to form a canopy that blotted out the moonlight. The air was colder here, sharp and biting against my skin, and the faint metallic scent I'd first noticed at the hospital returned, stronger now, filling my lungs with every breath. It wasn't just the scent of decay. It was the scent of something trying to push its way into the world. The trail led me to a clearing, its edges marked by jagged stones that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The chapel stood at its center, a crumbling ruin of wood and stone, its walls blackened with age and decay. Symbols were carved into the stones that surrounded it, their grooves deep and uneven, the same spiraling patterns I'd seen in the hospital and on the phone. They seemed to glow faintly in the light of my flashlight, their edges pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match the beat of my heart. The hum grew louder as I approached, the air vibrating around me, and I felt the weight of the chapel pressing against my thoughts. It wasn't just a building, it was a wound, a place where the veil between this world and something else had been torn open. The journal had said the shard was bound here, sealed beneath the earth by the rituals of those who had come before. But the seal was breaking. Moi. I could feel it. The door to the chapel hung crooked on its hinges, its surface splintered and worn, but the symbols carved into it were fresh, the grooves sharp and clean, as though someone had just finished them. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam casting jagged shadows across the walls, and the hum deepened, vibrating through the floorboards and into my chest. The room was empty, its walls lined with shattered pews and crumbling stone, but at the center of the floor was a circle, its edges marked with the same spiraling symbols that had followed me here. They were etched into the wood with such precision that it felt like the ground itself had been branded, the lines burning faintly in the darkness. I stepped closer, my breath catching as the air grew colder, and saw that the center of the circle was blackened, its surface charred and cracked as though something had burned its way through. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, threading through the hum like strands of smoke, but they grew louder with every second, their voices overlapping and chaotic. I couldn't understand the words, but the emotions they carried were clear. Fear, anger, desperation. They weren't just echoes. Moi. They were memories, fragments of the people who had been here before me, their lives bound to this place by the same force that had drawn me here. The ground trembled beneath my feet, the whispers rising to a crescendo, and I stumbled back as the circle began to glow, its spirals twisting and shifting like they were alive. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing against my chest, and I felt it, the presence I'd first sensed at the hospital, vast and unrelenting, pushing its way through the cracks in the veil. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor as the light flared brighter, illuminating the room in jagged bursts. The shadows twisted and writhed, their shapes bending in impossible ways, and I saw them, figures moving at the edges of the circle, their forms flickering like static. They weren't human, not anymore. Not anymore. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty, and their limbs moved with a jerking, unnatural rhythm. I tried to move, to run, but my legs refused to obey. The hum was everywhere now, filling my mind, my body, drowning out every thought but one. It ends here. Here. The light from the circle surged, blinding and searing, and the figures turned toward me, their hollow gazes locking onto mine. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. They weren't trying to stop me. They were trying to warn me. Is ein well de mabila ba. The ground splintered beneath me, the charred wood giving way to a jagged black void that seemed to pulse with light. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, from the darkness, came a voice, low and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. You've come to finish what they could not. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice. Not really. It was a presence, a force that pressed against the edges of my thoughts, unraveling me piece by piece. The light dimmed, the shadows stretching out around me, and I felt the pull again, the same pull I'd felt at the hospital, dragging me toward the center of the circle, toward the thing that waited beneath. I reached for the journal, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything that would tell me what to do. The words blurred together, their meanings slipping just out of reach. But one phrase stood out, scrawled in jagged letters across the bottom of the page. The veil must hold. The shard must not break. The ground trembled again, the darkness pressing closer, and I felt the weight of the decision settle over me. The chapel wasn't just a place. It was a barrier, a seal holding back something too vast, too terrible to comprehend. If the seal broke, the shard would escape, and if the shard escaped, it wouldn't stop with cedar pines. The presence surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and I took a deep breath, my hands tightening around the journal. The words on the page seemed to pulse, their meaning clear now, their urgency undeniable. I stepped into the circle, the light blinding as it consumed me, and made my choice. The light swallowed everything. For a moment, there was nothing but searing brightness, a blank void that erased the edges of my body, my thoughts, my very sense of being. I wasn't standing anymore. I was floating, weightless and untethered, in a space that stretched endlessly in every direction. The hum was there too, louder than before, vibrating through the emptiness, threading through me like an invisible tether. Then the void shifted, and I was falling. It wasn't like falling through air. Loose, lane. It was heavier, slower, as though I was sinking through water too thick to move in. Shapes began to form around me, faint and flickering at first, but growing sharper. With each passing second, the chapel, the symbols, the circle, they were all still there, but warped, distorted like reflections in broken glass. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, and I could feel the presence again, vast and unrelenting, pressing against me from every side. It was awake now. Fully awake. The figures I'd seen earlier were closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their limbs jerking in unnatural movements as they circled the edge of the broken seal. They were ent spirits, not in the way I'd imagined. They were something else entirely, something torn between this world and the one beneath it, their forms held together by the same force that was unraveling the air around us. They didn't move toward me, but I could feel their intent, their silent demand. Finish it. The ground beneath me cracked, splitting open to reveal a chasm of darkness that pulsed with faint, sickly light. The hum deepened, resonating through the splinters of reality, and I saw it, the shard. It wasn't an object, not exactly. It was a fragment of something far larger, something too vast to fully comprehend. Its edges were jagged, sharp, glowing faintly with an unnatural light that seemed to shift and twist, pulling at the air around it like a black hole. I could feel it pulling at me too, dragging me closer, threading itself through my thoughts. The whispers started again, faint and overlapping, their voices filled with fear and rage and desperation. They weren't just voices. They were memories, fragments of the lives that had been sacrificed to keep the shard contained. And now it was my turn. The journal was still in my hand, its pages fluttering in the unnatural wind that swirled around the chasm. I flipped through it desperately, searching for something I'd missed, some clue that would tell me how to fix this, how to end it. But the words were blurred, smudged, their meanings slipping just out of reach. Only one phrase stood out, scrawled in bold letters across a torn page. Eerie, life for the seal. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me closer to the edge of the chasm. My body was trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and I could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on me. If I didn't act, the seal would shatter completely. The shard would escape, and the world, my world, everyone's world, would become its hunting ground. But I wasn't ready to die. Not yet. And yet, the ground beneath me splintered, the cracks spreading outward like veins, and the figures at the edge of the circle began to move, their jerking motions growing faster, more frantic. The whispers rose to a crescendo, blending with the hum until it was all I could hear, all I could feel, a cacophony of sound and emotion that threatened to tear me apart. Then the presence spoke. You cannot contain me. The voice was everywhere, vast and deep, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my very bones. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was inside me, threading through my thoughts, unraveling me from the inside out. The light from the shard flared brighter, blinding and searing, and I felt the ground give way beneath me. I fell into the chasm, the darkness swallowing me whole, and for a moment there was nothing but cold and silence. Then the whispers returned, louder than ever, and I realized I wasn't alone. The memories were everywhere now, swirling around me like a storm, their shapes flickering in and out of focus. I saw their faces, their hands reaching for me, their hollow eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were trying to give me something, to show me the truth. The visions came in flashes, fragmented and chaotic. A woman standing in the center of the chapel, her hands raised as she chanted in a language I didn't recognize. A man carving the spirals into the stones with bloodied hands, his face twisted with fear. A group of figures gathered around the chasm, their voices blending into a single mournful hymn as they lowered a body into the darkness. Each vision burned itself into my mind, leaving behind the weight of what they'd done, what they'd sacrificed. They hadn't just sealed the shard. And unwind, yes, why, they'd bound themselves to it, their lives woven into the fabric of the veil, holding it together with their own existence. And now they were gone, their presence reduced to fragments, echoes trapped between worlds. The hum deepened, the darkness shifting around me, and I felt the shards pull again, stronger now, more insistent. It wasn't just trying to escape. It was trying to consume me, to pull me into itself and make me part of the seal. The presence surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and I felt the weight of its power pressing against me, suffocating and cold. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The journal was still in my hands, its pages glowing faintly in the darkness, and I flipped to the final entry, the ink sharp and jagged against the paper. The words were clear now, their meaning unmistakable. The seal is not broken. The seal is the sacrifice. I understood then. The seal wasn't something external, something separate. It was a part of the veil, a part of the shard, a part of me. To restore it, I had to give something up. Not just my life, but my existence, my presence in this world. I had to become the seal, to bind myself to the shard and hold it in place, just as the others had done before me. The figures around me began to fade, their hollow eyes locking onto mine as they dissolved into the darkness. The whispers softened, their voices blending into a single mournful note, and I felt the weight of their sacrifice settle over me. I took a deep breath, the hum vibrating through me one final time, and stepped into the light. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't anything like what I thought light should feel like. It was sharp, cold, like the edge of a blade dragged slowly over bare skin. It cut through me, peeling away the layers of my being, exposing everything raw and fragile. I wasn't sure if I was breathing anymore. I wasn't sure if I had lungs to breathe with. All I knew was the weight, pressing, endless, crushing. I thought I would fall apart, dissolve into the cold brilliance. But then I felt it, faint at first, like a flicker at the edge of my mind. The hum. It was still there, threading through the emptiness, tethering me to something beyond the light. It grew louder, vibrating through the fragments of my body, pulling me back together, forcing me to exist. Shapes began to form around me, faint and shifting, their edges blurred by the unnatural light. The ground was hard beneath my feet again, the air sharp in my lungs. I wasn't in a chapel anymore, or at least not the version of it I'd stepped into before. This place was broken, fractured, the walls twisting and bending in impossible angles. The spirals were everywhere, carved into every surface, glowing faintly like veins, pulsing with corrupted blood. The presence was stronger now, its weight pressing against me from all sides, vast and unrelenting. It wasn't just awake, it was aware, a force that had existed for longer than time itself, older than the earth beneath my feet, was looking at me, through me, and I felt the sharp, undeniable certainty that I didn't belong here. I was an intruder in its domain, a fragile, insignificant thing, standing on the edge of something I couldn't hope to understand. The chasm was still there, stretching out before me, its depths pulsing with the same sickly light that bled from the walls. The shard hovered above it, jagged and black, its edges flickering like static. It was smaller than I'd imagined, smaller than something so vast and terrible should have been. But its size didn't matter. I could feel its power, its hunger, radiating through the air, pulling at the edges of my mind. I took a step closer, my legs trembling beneath me, and the hum shifted, growing sharper, more insistent. The light from the shard flared, cutting through the darkness, and I saw them, the figures. They were clearer now, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, their movements slower, almost hesitant. They didn't try to stop me. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. The whispers returned, threading through the hum, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. But they weren't just voices anymore. They were words, clear and undeniable, carved into the air like the spirals etched into the walls. Behind it, I didn't understand at first. The journal hadn't said anything about binding, about what it meant to seal the shard. How new and it. But the longer I stood there, the longer I felt the weight of the presence pressing against me, the more the truth began to settle over me. Binding wasn't just about the shard. It wasn't just about the veil. So when you'd today, it was about me. The shard pulsed, the light growing brighter, and I felt the pull again, dragging me toward the edge of the chasm. My body moved without my consent, my feet slipping over the jagged ground as the hum rose to a deafening pitch. The air grew colder, sharper, and I felt it, something vast and endless wrapping around me, pulling me into its grasp. The figures began to move, their hollow eyes locking onto mine as they stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't attacking me. They were guiding me, their hands outstretched, their hollow voices blending into a single mournful note. They were showing me what I had to do, what I had to become. Ah, The journal was still in my hands, its pages glowing faintly, the words blurring as the light consumed them. But one phrase stood out, bold and jagged, carved into the paper like a scar. You are the seal. I took another step. The chasm yawning open before me, and I felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. There was no going back, no way out. The shard couldn't be destroyed. It couldn't be pushed back or forgot. It could only be bound, its power tethered to something stronger, something willing to hold it in place. My legs buckled as the pull grew stronger, dragging me to my knees at the edge of the chasm. Yes. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their voices blending into a deafening roar. And I felt the figures close around me, their hollow eyes glowing brighter, their presence wrapping around me like a second skin. They weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were relieved. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the edge of the shard. The light flared, blinding and searing, and the hum stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so deep it felt like a weight pressing against my chest. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, no presence. Just me, standing on the edge of eternity, holding the weight of something too vast to comprehend. And then the shard moved. It wasn't a physical movement, not in the way I understood. It shifted, bending and twisting, pulling itself into me. I felt it thread through my thoughts, my memories, my very existence, binding itself to me with an unrelenting force. The pain was unimaginable, sharp and searing, but it wasn't just physical. It was deeper, cutting through the fabric of who I was, unraveling me piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the binding. The figures stepped back, their hollow eyes dimming as they dissolved into the light. The spirals on the walls stopped glowing, their edges fading into the darkness, and the chasm began to close, the jagged ground knitting itself back together. The shard was quiet now, its power bound to me, its hunger dulled by the weight of the seal. But I wasn't the same. The hum returned, faint and distant, threading through the silence like a second heartbeat. It wasn't coming from the shard anymore. It was coming from me. El Kalusul Pangpai De. I stood at the center of the chapel, the air heavy and still, and felt the weight of the seal settle over me. The veil was intact, the shard contained, but I knew with a cold, sinking certainty that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I don't remember how I got back to the town. The woods seemed to fold around me, guiding me through the darkness. But the path was never clear. One moment I was in the chapel, the weight of the shard pressing against my chest, the hum threading through my thoughts, and the next I was standing at the edge of cedar pines. The faint glow of the streetlights cutting. The air felt wrong here, too still, too heavy. But I couldn't tell if it was the town that had changed, or if it was just me. The hum followed me home, faint and steady, like a second pulse beating just below the surface. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. A quiet reminder of what I'd done, of what I'd become. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, and tried to focus on the silence, on the way the room felt so unbearably empty. But the hum was there, threading through every thought, every breath, until it was impossible to tell where it ended. And I began. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shard, its jagged edges, its pulsing light, the way it had twisted and bent as it consumed me. I felt its weight pressing against my chest, felt the cold thread of it. It wasn't just inside me. It was me now, a part of who I was, as unshakable as the hum that followed me everywhere I went. The sun rose slowly, the faint light creeping through the cracks in the blinds, and I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that the shard wasn't dormant. It was waiting. The seal had held, for now, but I could feel its hunger, its endless, insatiable need. It wasn't bound to the chapel anymore. Graves. It was bound to me, and that bond was fragile. By the time I stepped outside, the town had begun to stir, its streets slowly filling with life. People moved through the square, their voices low, their faces drawn, as though they could feel the weight of the shard pressing against the edges of their world. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what I had done. But they could sense it, the same way they could sense a storm building on the horizon. Something had changed, and it wasn't finished. I made my way to Alex's house, my legs trembling with every step. He was waiting for me on the porch, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking as he gripped the railing. He didn't say anything as I approached, didn't ask what had happened in the chapel. He just looked at me, his gaze heavy with a mixture of relief and dread. "You sealed it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me like a second skin. "For now." He frowned, his brow furrowing as he studied me, and I could see the questions building in his mind. What had it cost? What had I given up to hold the seal in place? But he didn't ask. He didn't need to. The answer was written in the way my hands shook, the way my breath hitched every time the hum grew louder, threading through the silence like a warning. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling. I wanted to tell him yes. I wanted to tell him that everything was fine, that the shard was bound, that the town was safe, but I couldn't. Ooh. The truth pressed against my thoughts, cold and unrelenting, and I knew I couldn't lie to him. Not about this. "No," I said finally, my voice shaking. "It's not over. It's never going to be over." He looked away, his shoulders slumping, and for a moment, the silence between us was heavier than the hum. I could feel his despair, his helplessness, and I wanted to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that there was nothing he could have done. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with the weight of the shard, and I stayed silent. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavier than the last. The town began to recover, its people moving on as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't escape the weight of the shard. It was always there, pressing against me, threading through my thoughts, pulling at the edges of my mind. The hum never stopped, never faded, and I could feel the cracks forming, small but growing with every passing moment. I spent hours staring at the journal, its pages worn and brittle, the words blurred by the light of the shard that pulsed faintly in the back of my mind. I read and reread the final entry, its meaning twisting and shifting with every pass. The seal is the sacrifice. I understood now what it meant, what it had always meant. The shard wasn't just bound to me, it was consuming me slowly and steadily, threading itself deeper into my being with every beat of the hum. The nightmares started soon after. I saw the chapel, its walls twisting and bending, the spirals glowing faintly in the darkness. I saw the figures, their hollow eyes watching me, their hands reaching for me, pulling me into the chasm. I saw the shard, jagged and black, its light pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. And I saw the cracks, splintering outward, breaking the seal, shattering the veil. The final dream was the worst. I was standing in the center of the chapel, the light of the shard blinding and cold, and I could feel it pulling at me, unraveling me piece by piece. The figures were gone, their hollow forms dissolved into the light, and I was alone. But I wasn't. The presence was there, vast and unrelenting, pressing against me with an intensity that threatened to tear me apart. It spoke, its voice low and resonant, cutting through the silence like a blade. The seal will not hold. I woke up gasping, the hum roaring in my ears, and I knew the shard wasn't bound. Not really. The seal was temporary, a fragile thread holding back something too vast, too powerful to contain. It wasn't a matter of if it would break, it was a matter of when. I stood at the edge of the forest that night, the journal clutched tightly in my hands, and stared into the darkness. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the air, threading through the trees, pulling at the edges of the world. The shard was waiting, and so was I. Heal, tuned, dia. The air around the mine felt wrong. It wasn't just the stale, suffocating weight of the earth pressing down from above. It was deeper than that, more primal, standing there at the edge of the collapsed shaft. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath my feet wasn't solid. It felt alive, like the earth itself was breathing, waiting. I knew better than to believe in folklore, but I couldn't deny the unease crawling under my skin, whispering to me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. The first thing that hit me when I descended into the mine was the smell. It was thick and metallic, heavy with the scent of rust and decay, like the mine itself had been bleeding for years. The flickering beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness ahead, its light swallowed by the endless tunnels that stretched out before me. The walls were close, the air damp, and every step I took echoed back to me in strange, fractured ways, like the mine was mimicking my movements, mocking them. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on the notebook in my bag filled with diagrams and charts of the mine's layout. But the truth was, none of it mattered. The shaft collapse was just an excuse. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew what had brought me here. The missing miners. 10 of them gone without a trace, leaving behind nothing but overturned equipment and faint whispers of what the locals called the Hollow Ones. Yet I wasn't here for ghost stories. And then, panic. I wasn't here to make sense of the ridiculous rumors that had spread like wildfire since the disappearance. I was here to find answers, tangible ones, the kind that could be written down in reports and backed by science. But as I moved deeper into the mine, the air grew colder, heavier, pressing against my chest with a weight I couldn't explain. The whispers weren't real. I told myself that, but they sounded real enough. The first signs of the miners were subtle. Rendezvous de venin, sigoma, to first signs. A discarded helmet, its light broken and flickering faintly. A metal lunchbox, dented and lying on its side, its contents scattered across the ground. The tunnel walls were jagged here, scarred with deep grooves that didn't look like they'd been made by machinery. They twisted and spiraled in strange, almost deliberate patterns, the lines overlapping in ways that made my head ache if I looked at them for too long. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, just at the edge of hearing, a whisper threading through the stillness, so quiet I could barely make out the words. Heck, it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the creak of the mine settling. It was something else, something alive, shifting just out of reach. I stopped, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and strained to listen. The whisper grew louder, a soft, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, the ground, my chest. It wasn't coming from ahead or behind. It was coming from everywhere, threading through the air like a needle pulling at the edges of my thoughts. I turned a corner and stopped, dead. The tunnel opened into a wide cavern, its walls slick with moisture and covered in the same spiraling patterns I'd seen earlier. But these were different. They glowed faintly, their edges pulsing with a sickly green light that flickered like fireflies caught in a jar. The air was colder here, sharp and biting against my skin, and the hum was louder, resonating through the cavern like a low, steady drumbeat. At the center of the cavern was a circle, its edges marked with jagged stones, arranged in a way that felt deliberate, ritualistic. The ground within the circle was scorched, the earth blackened and cracked, and at its center lay a single object, a miner's helmet, its light shattered, its surface slick with something dark and glistening. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, and felt the air grow heavier with every step. The hum deepened, vibrating through my chest. and the symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their spirals twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. I knelt by the circle, my flashlight casting long shadows across the ground, and reached out to touch the helmet. The instant my fingers brushed against it, the hum surged, the sound rising to a deafening roar that echoed through the cavern, shaking the ground beneath me. The light from the symbols flared brighter, blinding and cold, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest as the air around me seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like heat rising off asphalt. And then I saw it, a shape, barely more than a shadow, moving at the edges of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its body flickering like static against the darkness. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough, pressing against me like a physical weight, filling the air with a low, resonant hum that threaded through my thoughts, unraveling them piece by piece. I couldn't move. No. I couldn't breathe. The light from the symbols pulsed, growing faster, brighter, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble, the jagged stones shifting as though the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. The shadow tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt its gaze lock onto mine, though it had no eyes, no face, nothing that could have looked at me. The whispers returned then, louder this time, blending with the hum, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. They weren't words, not exactly, but I understood them all the same. They were promises, threats, warnings, and then the light flickered, the cavern plunging into darkness, and the whispers stopped. The hum was gone, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a weight pressing against my chest. I scrambled back toward the tunnel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and fumbled with my flashlight, its beam flickering weakly as I pointed it into the void. The cavern was empty. The symbols were gone, the stones undisturbed, the ground unmarked. The helmet still lay at the center of the circle, its surface dark and glistening, but there was no sign of the shadow, no sign of the light, no sign of the whispers. But the hum was still there, faint and steady, threading through the silence like a second heartbeat. I ran. Only, by the time I made it back to the surface, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting the mountains in a muted haze of pale orange and gray. The morning light should have felt comforting, but it didn't. It only made the jagged trees and the black mouth of the mine behind me look even starker, even more wrong. The hum was still there, faint but steady, threading through my thoughts like a splinter I couldn't pull free. I drove back into town with my hands locked tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the worn leather. The streets of Cedar Hollow were empty at this hour, the storefronts dark, the windows of houses shuttered against the cold. It should have been quiet, peaceful, but the stillness felt heavy now, like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting. My first stop was the survey office, a squat brick building that looked like it had been built 100 years ago and hadn't been cleaned since. The place smelled like mildew and old coffee, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, adding to the constant hum in my head. I dumped my gear on the desk and opened my field notes, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The diagrams and charts I'd sketched out were a mess, the lines jagged and uneven, the notes scribbled in a hand I barely recognized as my own. The words didn't make sense. They were fragmented, scattered, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. Symbols, shadows, and the helmet. It all blurred together, tangled in my memory, and I couldn't tell if it was the mind that was twisting things in my mind, or if it was just me. The hum grew louder, vibrating faintly through the desk beneath my hands, and I closed the notebook with a snap, shoving it aside. I needed to get a grip. I needed answers. And the old mining reports were stored in a filing cabinet in the corner, buried beneath decades of dust and neglect. I pulled the drawers open, flipping through the brittle pages, until I found what I was looking for. The incident reports from the original collapse in 1947. The records were sparse, filled with the kind of vague bureaucratic language that said a lot without actually saying anything. But one detail caught my eye, scrawled in the margin of a yellowed report. Enders amazing. The marks appeared before the collapse. We told them not to go deeper, but they wouldn't listen. The marks. The spirals. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, my chest tightening as the memory of the glowing patterns in the cavern came rushing back. The miners back then had seen them too. They'd known something was wrong, but they hadn't stopped. Or maybe they couldn't. The hum shifted, growing sharper, and I turned, the room tilting slightly as I moved. For a moment I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, a shadow slipping through the narrow window in the back. But when I stepped closer, there was nothing there. Just the empty alley behind the building, littered with broken crates, and the faint glint of frost on the ground. I slammed the drawer shut and grabbed my jacket, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet room. The air felt heavy again, pressing against my chest, and I couldn't stay here, not with the shadows moving at the edge of my vision, not with the hum threading through the silence like a warning I couldn't ignore. The town library was just a few blocks away, its old stone facade cracked and weathered from years of neglect. The inside smelled like dust and paper, the kind of smell that always used to make me feel safe. But now, it just felt stifling, like the walls were closing in around me. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Carson, gave me a wary look as I stepped inside, her eyes lingering on the dirt smeared across my clothes. "Morning?" she asked, her voice light but cautious. I forced a smile and nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The hum was louder here, echoing faintly through the stacks, and I could feel my pulse quicken with every step I took toward the back of the room, where the archives were kept. The old newspapers were stacked haphazardly on metal shelves, their headlines faded and yellowed with age. Most of them were mundane, articles about local elections, community fairs, obituaries, but tucked between them were glimpses of something darker. Miners report strange occurrences underground. Mysterious disappearances near Hollow Ridge. Ebule, Daitsu, Aundao, Distitu, Badasu, collapsed mine claims. Lives of 22. Tort. The articles blurred together, the dates and details overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. It wasn't just one collapse. There had been others, stretching back decades, all tied to the same mine. The same strange occurrences, and in every story, the same details surfaced. The spirals, the whispers, the shadows. I pulled an older article from the stack, its edges crumbling beneath my fingers, and scanned the text. It was from 1912, a short piece buried in the back of the paper, but it sent a chill down my spine. Locals claimed to hear voices near the mine at night, warning them to stay away. Symbols have been carved into the trees around the entrance, though their origin remains unknown. Residents speak of the hollow ones, but no one will. The words felt heavy, sharp, like they were cutting through the thin veneer of logic I'd been clinging to. The hollow ones. I'd heard the name whispered before, half-jokingly, by some of the miners who still worked the active shafts near Cedar Hollow. Or they'd laugh about it, dismiss it as just another piece of local folklore. Then, but I could hear the edge of fear in their voices, the unspoken truth they didn't want to admit. The hum surged again, louder this time, and I dropped the paper, my breath catching in my throat. The air in the library felt colder now, heavier, and the faintest whisper threaded through the silence, so soft I could almost convince myself it wasn't real. Almost. I turned, my pulse racing, and saw the shadow again, flickering at the edge of the stacks. It was closer this time. Its limbs too long, its movements too slow, too deliberate. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. But it was watching me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine as the whisper grew louder, blending with the hum into a single, unrelenting rhythm. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I clutched at the edge of the shelf, and the shadow tilted its head, its form flickering like static against the dim light. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the air around me growing colder, sharper, and for a moment I thought I saw something else. A figure standing just behind the shadow, its face obscured, its hand outstretched. Then the light flickered, and they were gone. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in the aisle of the library. The whisper was still faint in the air, threading its way through the stacks, quieter now, but no less insistent. It wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from the space it had left behind, a hollow sound that sank deep into my bones, making it hard to breathe. The old article I'd dropped lay crumpled on the floor. Adieu, Suis. The words stared back at me from the brittle paper, their faded ink more vivid in my mind than on the page. The hollow ones. Ali. I whispered the name aloud, half expecting the air to shift, for something unseen to stir in response. But nothing happened. At least, Not yet. I left the library in a daze, my thoughts racing faster than my feet could carry me. Outside, the streets of Cedar Hollow seemed unnaturally quiet. The early morning sun should have burned off the mist by now, but it clung to the edges of the buildings, thicker and colder than it should have been. Shadows lingered in the corners of my vision, slipping between the trees and buildings. But when I turned to look, they dissolved into nothing. The hum was quieter now, a faint vibration threading through the air, but it was still there, steady and unrelenting. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the town, in the ground beneath my feet, in the spaces between breaths. I couldn't escape it. I should have gone home, locked my door, and ignored the pull that had led me to the mine in the first place. But instead, I found myself driving back out to the shaft, the tires of my car crunching over gravel and frost. The road felt longer this time, the trees on either side pressing closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The air grew colder with every mile, until my breath fogged the windshield in front of me. But when I arrived, the mine entrance was just as I'd left it, a gaping black void in the earth, surrounded by rusted equipment and the remnants of long-abandoned buildings. But there was something else now, something I hadn't seen before. A faint light flickered deep within the shaft, pulsing in time with the hum, its glow faint but unmistakable. I didn't want to go back inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave and never come back. But the pull was stronger now, a force I couldn't resist. It wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion, an invisible hand dragging me forward, step by step, until I was standing at the edge of the entrance once more. The darkness swallowed me whole as I stepped inside, the light of my flashlight barely cutting through the heavy air. The walls of the tunnel pressed close around me, damp and cold, and every step I took sent echoes, spiraling off into the distance, bouncing back in strange, distorted patterns. The symbols on the walls were still there, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the light, twisting and shifting when I looked at them too long. The pulsing light grew brighter as I moved deeper into the mine, its rhythm matching the hum that vibrated through the air. It wasn't steady, though. It flickered, uneven and erratic, like something struggling to break free. I turned a corner, the ground beneath my boots slick with moisture, and stopped dead. The cavern was different now. The circle at its center had changed, the stones around its edge glowing faintly with the same pulsing light that came from the chasm beyond. The air here was colder than ever, sharp and biting against my skin, and the hum was louder, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my teeth. The helmet I'd seen before was gone, replaced by something else. A figure. It was standing at the edge of the circle, its back to me, its outline blurred and shifting in the faint light. It wasn't one of the miners, and its limbs were too long, its body too thin, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was testing the air around it. It tilted its head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear, and I felt the hum surge sharp and jarring, like a knife pressed against my thoughts. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as the figure turned toward me. Its face was hollow, empty, its features lost in the shifting static of its form, but its eyes, if they could be called that, burned with a faint, sickly light, like two embers smoldering in the dark. It didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough, pressing against me like a weight, filling the air with a low, resonant hum that drowned out everything else. I took a step back, my legs trembling, and felt my heel catch on the edge of a stone. The sound echoed through the cavern, sharp and jarring, and the figure shifted, its hollow gaze locking onto mine. The hum grew louder, deeper, and the air around me seemed to ripple, bending and twisting like the surface of water. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and turned to run. But the tunnel behind me was gone. The walls had twisted, closing in on themselves, their jagged edges forming a spiral that led back into the cavern. The light pulsed brighter, blinding and cold, and I felt the pull again, stronger now, dragging me toward the circle. The whispers started again, louder this time, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus that filled the air, threading through the hum, through my thoughts, unraveling them piece by piece. They weren't words, they were emotions, sharp and jagged, cutting through me like glass. Fear, despair, hunger, torture, du stul, ga, ve. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating and cold. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground, and I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as the hum rose to a deafening roar. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by silence, so deep it felt like a void, swallowing everything around me. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes burning brighter, and I heard it, a voice low and resonant, threading through the stillness. You are not supposed to be here. The voice didn't come from the figure. Not exactly. It was deeper than that, resonating through the air, through the walls, through me. It was layered, as though it was speaking from several places at once, each word threading through my mind, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't move. Bah, damals, bay, the tooth fisher. My body felt frozen, my legs locked in place, my chest tight with a weight I couldn't lift. The figure didn't step closer, but its presence did, pressing against me like a tide of cold air. The light in its hollow eyes burned brighter, its flickering form shifting and distorting, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. Or maybe it wasn't struggling at all. Maybe it was letting me see only what it wanted me to see. The circle on the ground pulsed again, its spirals twisting in ways that made my head ache, and the hum rose, vibrating through my chest until I thought my ribs might crack under the pressure. The cavern felt alive now, its walls twisting and bending, the shadows at the edges moving in unnatural patterns. They weren't reflections of me. They weren't reflections of anything. The voice returned, low and resonant, threading through the silence. The seal is broken. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, tangled with the cold weight of fear that gripped me. My hands shook at my sides, useless against the force, pressing down on me. The air felt thinner here, harder to breathe, like the space itself was suffocating. I wanted to run, to claw my way out of the mine, and never look back, but I knew there was no escape. Not any more. Leafville. The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, and the whispers began again, faint and distant, threading through the hum like strands of smoke. They weren't words, not this time. They were images, memories that weren't mine, flashing through my mind in jagged, chaotic fragments. I saw the miners, their faces pale and drawn, their voices trembling as they stood in this very cavern, their hands outstretched toward the circle. I saw the spirals glowing faintly on the walls, the light pulsing in time with the hum, and the shadow that rose from the depths of the chasm, twisting and flickering, its hollow gaze fixed on them. And then I saw the sacrifice. The memory hit me like a blow, sharp and unrelenting, and I doubled over, gasping for air. The miners hadn't just been here to work. They'd been here to appease something, to bind it, to keep it from breaking free. But they hadn't succeeded. Or maybe they had, and the seal had only held for so long before something shifted, something failed. The light from the circle grew brighter, blinding and cold, and I felt the pull again, stronger now, dragging me toward the center. My body moved without my consent, my legs trembling as I stepped closer, the ground beneath me slick and uneven. The whispers grew louder, blending with the hum, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel, threading through my thoughts, unraveling them piece by piece. And then I was inside the circle. The air was colder here, sharp and biting against my skin, and the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, soft and spongy, like it wasn't solid anymore. The spirals twisted and bent, their edges glowing brighter, and I felt the presence surge forward, vast and unrelenting, pressing against me with a force that made my knees buckle. The figure raised a hand, its movements slow and deliberate, and the hum deepened, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through me. The voice returned, louder this time, cutting through the whispers like a blade. One must stay. I didn't understand at first. The words didn't make sense, their meaning slipping through my mind like water through my fingers. But then the whispers shifted, their tone changing, and I realized they weren't speaking to me anymore. They were speaking about me. The spirals flared brighter, their edges searing into my vision, and I felt the pull again, dragging me deeper into the circle, into the light. The ground beneath me trembled, the chasm opening wider, and I saw it, the thing that waited below. It wasn't a shadow. Not exactly. It was something vast and endless, its edges flickering and twisting, its form impossible to comprehend. It wasn't bound by the same rules, the same limits that held everything else together. It was older than that, older than the mine, older than the earth itself. And it was hungry. The whispers rose to a crescendo, the air vibrating with the force of their voices, and I felt the weight of their intent settle over me. The miners hadn't just disappeared. They'd been taken, their lives offered up to keep the seal intact, to keep the thing in the chasm from breaking free. And now it wanted another. The figure stepped closer, its hollow gaze locking onto mine, and I felt the cold weight of its presence wrap around me, threading through my thoughts, my memories pulling at the edges of who I was. It wasn't just watching me. It was deciding, measuring, choosing. Daddy, Kilial, Stivumodada, Umpatpachai, Ghosts. The hum grew louder, deafening now, and I felt the ground give way beneath me, the light swallowing everything, blinding and cold. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a void, stretching out forever. And then the voice returned, soft but unrelenting. Will you give? The question wasn't a command. It wasn't a demand. It was a choice. I could feel it, sharp and heavy, pressing against me from all sides. The seal could be repaired, the spirals could hold, but only if someone stayed, if someone became the anchor that held the thing in the chasm, bound and contained. Without it, the seal would shatter, the hum would rise, and the thing would break free, spilling out into the world beyond. I closed my eyes, the cold light burning against my skin, and tried to breathe. The whispers were gone, the hum was fading, and all that remained was the weight of the choice, pressing down on me, vast and unrelenting. The weight of the question lingered, pressing against me like the air in the mine, heavy and suffocating. My knees hit the ground, the sharp pain barely registering beneath the crushing force of the presence. Surrounding me, the whispers were gone, and the silence that replaced them was worse. It felt alive, charged with the anticipation of an answer I didn't know how to give. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My voice was gone, stolen by the thing in the chasm, its vastness unraveling my thoughts with every second that passed. The figure stood before me, motionless but unrelenting, its hollow gaze burning with a faint cold light. It wasn't waiting for words. It was waiting for something deeper, something final. The ground beneath me shifted, the spirals glowing brighter, their light twisting and bending as though they were alive. The hum returned, faint at first, but growing louder, sharper, vibrating through my chest and skull like a pulse that wasn't my own. I tried to pull away, to push myself back from the edge of the chasm, but the pull was stronger now, dragging me forward, closer to the impossible thing that waited below. The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, and I felt its gaze cut through me, peeling back the layers of who I was. Memories rose unbidden, flashing through my mind in sharp, jagged fragments. Moments I'd buried, faces I'd tried to forget, the choices I'd made, the mistakes I couldn't undo. It was sifting through them, pulling at the pieces that made me, unspooling them like thread. And then it showed me. The cavern dissolved, replaced by a vision so vivid it felt more real than the ground beneath me. I was standing in a familiar place, a place I hadn't seen in years. My childhood home, the small, weathered house at the edge of the woods. The light was dim, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. And there, in the doorway, was my mother. Her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a sorrow I couldn't understand. She was speaking, her voice low and trembling, but I couldn't hear the words. The hum was there, faint but steady, threading through the vision like a thread, pulling at the edges of my memory. The image shifted, the walls of the house twisting and bending, and I saw her again, standing at the edge of the woods, her hands outstretched towards something I couldn't see. The vision shattered, replaced by another, and then another. A spiral of moments, of choices, all leading to this. To me, standing in the center of the circle, the light of the spirals searing into my vision. The presence surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and I felt its intent settle over me like a weight I couldn't lift. Will you give? The words cut through the silence, sharp and undeniable, and I understood then what it wanted. It wasn't asking for my life. It was asking for more than that, for my presence, my existence. The thread of who I was to be woven into the spirals, into the seal, binding the thing in the chasm for as long as it could hold. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it was an erasure, a choice to become something less, something forgotten. I didn't want to give it. I didn't want to lose myself to this place, to this thing, to the endless hum that had threaded its way through my mind since the moment I stepped into the mine. But the choice wasn't mine alone. The spirals twisted and bent, their light flaring brighter, and I saw the faces of the miners, their hollow eyes filled with a terrible kind of understanding. They had made the same choice long ago. And now it was my turn. The ground beneath me trembled, the chasm yawning wider, and I felt the pull again, dragging me closer to the edge. The figure stepped back, its hollow gaze fixed on me, and the hum rose, deafening and unrelenting, vibrating through the cavern like the pulse of something alive. I closed my eyes, the light burning against my eyelids, and reached for the memory of my mother's voice, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hands. But the presence was there, threading through the memory, unraveling it piece by piece, until all that remained was the hum. I opened my eyes and stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and stepped forward. The spirals flared brighter, their edges sharp and jagged, and I felt the ground beneath me give way, the chasm swallowing me whole. The cold was immediate, sharp and biting. But it wasn't the cold of the earth. It was deeper than that, a void that pressed against me from all sides, threading through my thoughts, my memories, my soul. The whispers returned, louder now, blending with the hum into a single, unrelenting chorus, and I felt the weight of the seal settle over me, vast and unyielding. The thing in the chasm surged forward, its edges flickering and bending, and I reached out, my hands trembling as I touched the light. It wasn't light. It wasn't anything I could name. It was everything and nothing, vast and endless, and it consumed me, threading through the fabric of who I was, unmaking me piece by piece. I felt the spirals twist and bend, their edges searing into my mind, and I understood then what the miners had done, what they had become. The seal wasn't just a barrier. It was a prison, a binding that required more than just life. It required presence, memory, the very essence of being. It required someone to hold it in place, to anchor the spirals, to keep the thing in the chasm from breaking free. And now it was my turn. When the light pulled me under, I expected pain, something sharp, something finite. But what I felt instead was emptiness, cold and vast, stretching out endlessly in every direction. I wasn't falling. I wasn't even floating. I was dissolving. My thoughts unraveled like threads, slipping free from a tapestry, each one stretching further into the void, disappearing into the light, until I couldn't tell where they ended, and I began. The spirals were everywhere now, twisting and bending through the air around me, their edges glowing with a faint, sickly light. They weren't symbols anymore. They were alive, shifting and pulsing like veins, pumping through some great, unseen body. The hum was louder here, sharper, vibrating through the void in rhythmic bursts that matched the frantic beating of my heart. I tried to reach for something, anything, that would ground me, that would pull me back from the edge of whatever this was. But there was nothing to hold onto. My memories, my fears, my very sense of self were slipping away, unraveling into the spirals, threading through the hum until they were no longer mine. I didn't even feel the pull anymore. It wasn't dragging me forward because I was already part of it. And then the presence returned. It was vast, unrelenting, pressing against me from all sides, threading itself through every thought, every feeling, every piece of who I was. It wasn't a voice this time. It was knowing. A truth so ancient and immense that it bypassed words entirely, searing itself into my mind with a weight that threatened to crush me. The thing in the chasm wasn't just awake. It was aware of me, of the spirals, of the fragile barrier holding it in place. You are not enough. The thought was mine, but it wasn't. It echoed through me, through the spirals, resonating with the hum in a way that made my chest tighten, made the air too thin to breathe. The seal wasn't complete. The spirals were fraying, the edges bending and twisting under the strain, and the thing in the chasm was pushing against them, pressing against the barrier with a force that threatened to shatter it entirely. I was failing. The realization hit me like a blow, sharp and cold, and I felt the weight of it settle over me, dragging me deeper into the spirals. I couldn't hold this. I wasn't strong enough. Evidently, I wasn't strong enough. The seal was crumbling, the lines unraveling, and I was falling apart with it, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left of me, just another hollow whisper, threading through the void, lost and forgotten. The presence surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a force, pushing and pulling, bending and breaking, tearing at the fabric of the spirals until the barrier between worlds began to buckle. And then I saw them. POV, Shivun, Island. The figures appeared at the edges of the light, their forms flickering and distorted, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They weren't real. They couldn't be. But their presence filled the space around me, pressing against the spirals, threading through the hum like a chorus of voices too faint to understand. They were watching me, waiting, their empty faces turned toward the chasm as the thing below pushed harder, its edges flickering and bending, trying to break through. The spirals twisted again, their light flaring brighter, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. The chasm widening as the seal began to collapse. The figures stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate, and I felt their presence wrap around me, cold and heavy, threading through my thoughts like the hum itself. And then they spoke. Hold. The word cut through the hum, sharp and unrelenting. And I felt the weight of it settle over me, pressing against my chest like a hand forcing me to the ground. The figures weren't speaking to me. Him. They weren't speaking at all. The word wasn't sound, it was force. A command that rippled through the spirals, through the hum, pushing back against the presence in the chasm. Hold. The spirals pulsed again, their edges sharper now, their light twisting and bending as they pushed against the thing below. I could feel them straining, pulling at the edges of the barrier, trying to force it back into place. But it wasn't enough. The thing in the chasm surged forward, vast and unrelenting, and I felt the spirals bend under the strain, their light flickering as the seal began to crack. I reached out, my hands trembling, and felt the spirals twist around me, threading through my fingers, my arms, my chest. They weren't just lines anymore. They were alive, pulsing with the hum, their edges sharp and jagged as they pulled at me, binding me to the barrier, to the seal, to the thing in the chasm. I could feel it pushing back, pressing against me with a force that threatened to break me entirely. The figures stepped closer, their hollow eyes burning brighter, and I felt their presence wrap around me, threading through the spirals, through the hum, pulling at the edges of my mind. They weren't real. They couldn't be. But Their intent was clear. Bait come. The word hit me like a blow, sharp and cold, and I felt the spirals twist tighter, their edges cutting into me, threading through my thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self. They were binding me to the seal, weaving me into the spirals, making me part of the barrier, holding the thing in the chasm. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a question. It was a command, unrelenting and absolute. The spirals flared brighter, their light searing into my vision, and I felt the weight of the seal settle over me, vast and unyielding. The thing in the chasm pushed harder, its presence surging forward, and I felt the spirals bend and crack, their edges fraying under the strain. Hold, bold. The figures were gone. The spirals were gone. The chasm was gone. All that remained was the hum, vast and unrelenting, threading through the void as the weight of the seal pressed against me, binding me to the barrier, to the spirals, to the thing in the chasm. And then silence. When the silence came, it wasn't the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. No hum, no whispers, no pressure pressing against my chest, just an empty, hollow stillness that stretched out forever. I wasn't sure if I was standing, floating, or if I even existed anymore. The spirals were gone, the light was gone, and the presence in the chasm had receded, its vastness replaced by a void that felt even more suffocating. For a moment, I thought I was free, that it was over. But then I felt it, the faintest vibration, threading through the stillness, pulling at the edges of my thoughts. It was different now, softer but deeper, resonating through me like a second heartbeat. It wasn't the hum, it was me. The spirals hadn't just taken me, they had made me part of them. I could feel their weight now, vast and unrelenting, threading through my being, binding me to the barrier. The chasm was no longer just a hole in the earth. It was inside me, its edges sharp and jagged, its hunger endless. The thing I had been holding back was quiet now, but its presence lingered, a faint echo pressing against the edges of my mind. The world began to take shape around me, the void dissolving into jagged shadows and faint light. I was back in the cavern, the spirals etched into the walls, their edges glowing faintly in the dim light. The circle at the center of the room was empty now. The stones cold and dark, their energy spent. The chasm was gone, its jagged edges sealed, but the weight of it remained, pressing against me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I took a step forward, my legs trembling beneath me, and felt the air shift, colder and sharper than before. The cavern was silent, the whispers gone, but I could feel the faint vibration of the spirals threading through the walls, the floor, the very air itself. They weren't alive anymore, not in the way they had been, but they weren't dead either. They were waiting, holding, tethered to me in a way that I couldn't undo. The climb back to the surface was slower this time, each step heavier than the last. The tunnels seemed darker now, their walls pressing closer, the air colder and thinner. My flashlight flickered in my hand, its beam weak and uneven. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The hum was still there, faint but steady, threading through the silence, and I knew it would never leave me. When I finally emerged from the mine, the sky was pale with the first light of dawn. The faint glow of the sun cutting through the mist that clung to the mountains. The air was cold, sharp and biting against my skin, but it felt thin, empty, like the weight of the chasm had followed me here, pressing against the edges of the world. The town below was silent, its streets empty, its buildings dark, and for a moment I felt like the only person left alive. But I wasn't alone. The shadow was there, waiting for me, at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence filled the air, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest like the weight of the spirals. It wasn't the same as the thing in the chasm. It didn't have the same vastness, the same hunger, but it was connected to it, a fragment of something larger, something older. It tilted its head, its hollow gaze locking onto mine, and for a moment I thought it would speak, but the silence stretched on, unbroken, and the shadow dissolved, slipping into the mist like smoke carried away by the wind. It wasn't gone, not really. Envelop, siu fire, that pigwell, God begs. It was waiting, watching, just like the spirals. And just like the thing in the chasm. The drive back to Cedar Hollow felt longer this time. The road twisting and bending in ways that didn't feel right. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming jagged shapes against the pale sky, and the faint vibration of the spirals threaded through the silence, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I couldn't tell if the world had changed, or if it was just me. The streets of the town were empty when I arrived. The buildings dark and silent, their windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. The hum was quieter here, fainter, but it was still there, threading through the air, the ground, the walls. I parked the car and sat there for a long time, staring at the empty streets, my hands trembling against the steering wheel. I didn't go home. I couldn't. Instead, I walked to the edge of town, to the place where the forest began. The trees stretching out into the mountains like dark sentinels. The air was colder here, sharper, and the faint vibration of the spirals was stronger, threading through the ground beneath my feet, pulling me forward, deeper into the wood. The cabin was still there, hidden among the trees, its walls weathered and cracked, its windows dark and empty. It had been years since I'd been here, since I'd stood on this porch and felt the weight of my mother's gaze pressing against me, her voice trembling as she spoke of things I hadn't understood. But I understood now. Now I understood too well. Edidime, Chaves, Anikanin, Sunu, Fay. The door creaked open beneath my hand, the sound sharp and jarring in the silence, and the air inside was colder, heavier, filled with the faint scent of earth and decay. The spirals were here too, etched into the walls, their edges glowing faintly in the dim light. They weren't new. They had always been here, waiting, their presence threading through the house like a shadow that never left. I stepped inside, the door closing softly behind me, and felt the weight of the spirals settle over me, vast and unrelenting. The hum was louder now, threading through the silence, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. It wasn't the mine anymore. It wasn't the chasm. It was me, and it always would be. I sat on the floor, the spirals glowing faintly around me, their edges twisting and bending in ways that made my head ache. The hum pulsed in time with my heartbeat, steady and unrelenting, and I knew that the thing in the chasm wasn't gone. It was waiting, bound to the spirals, bound to me, its vastness pressing against the edges of the world. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by something deeper, colder. I was the seal now, the anchor that held the spirals in place, that kept the thing in the chasm from breaking free. But the seal was fragile, and the spirals were fraying, their edges bending under the strain. It wasn't a matter of if they would break, it was a matter of when. And when they did, I would still be here, waiting.